Last time, we discussed Nietzsche's admiration for the religion of Buddhism. He sees it as a religion altogether more realistic, more logical, and more effective than Christianity. And he recognizes in Buddhism a form of mental training that was appropriate to the time and place in which it was birthed. A declining civilization which has become hypersensitive, which has become agnostic and doubtful of everything after centuries of exhausting themselves in intellectual pursuits. All civilizations, all cultures, all social arrangements, it seems, eventually come to their end. And when a civilization is ending, there is perhaps no better remedy for the final representatives of that old civilization than Buddhism, which guides them in passively accepting their demise. Epistemologically, the Buddhist view of the non-identity of the self, Nietzsche would find to be largely accurate. As Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the self is both a multiplicity and a unity, a flock and a shepherd. As the Buddhists say, the self is an aggregation of multiple things which are non-identical. And while Nietzsche's deconstruction of selfhood does not approach the rigor of the Buddhist conception of the five skandhas, or their doctrine of dependent origination, we can nevertheless see that Nietzsche is, at least, of a similar mindset regarding the web of causes and conditions that produce a so-called individual, a self. It's bound up with fate in some sense. Each person is a piece of fate, and to wish to change one thing, one factor, one event, or one cause from one's past would require that you completely transform the whole. Furthermore, the Buddhist account of suffering as desire, in some sense. Nietzsche would have been acquainted with this account through Schopenhauer, and he would have understood it through his concept of the will. He was also very familiar with the negative hedonism of Epicurus, that he understood as in some sense analogous to Buddhism, and the view of being as essentially impermanent that we find in Anaximander, even though Anaximander and Schopenhauer differ, as Nietzsche sees it, on the value of existence. But Nietzsche would have even agreed with this to some extent, in that he sees pleasure and pain as intensely interrelated, that to try and reduce suffering would also reduce joy, would also reduce pleasure. Nietzsche also presents the argument in the inverse, that if you were to heighten pleasure, it would require a correspondent heightening of suffering. Ultimately, it boils down to the same thing. You can't have pleasure without suffering. The two are interrelated. And as such, I have often described the Nietzschean worldview in comparison to that of Schopenhauer as Nietzsche affirming the will, affirming samsara, rather than attempting to deny it or transcend it in some way. And this ought to help elucidate not only why Nietzsche finds so much agreement with Buddhism, but also why he ultimately has to oppose Buddhism in terms of its ethical worldview and its rejection of the physical world, of an embodied existence. Nietzsche acknowledges that Buddhism's ethical outlook was the appropriate one for a given time and place, in a certain set of circumstances, but the notion of a European Buddhism haunts Nietzsche. It's one possible outcome that might come out of this interregnum of values that occurs during the dawning awareness of the death of God, which is the devaluation of all values. And so Nietzsche's wish is that we would come to a principle of a new valuation that could emerge during this crisis. A European Buddhism, on the other hand, would represent yet another failed outcome in the grand experiment of nature, another repetition of the same story of ascent and decline. One way to look at this problem is to consider Nietzsche's assessment of Gautama Buddha as the great physiologist. Buddha was able to determine the ideal remedy for the exhausted hypersensitive nerves of a dying people. He shows them how to serenely accept their extinction. We might say old age and death are a natural part of life, and there is a healthy way to age, and a healthy way to confront death even. And this is Siddhartha Gautama's revelation when he leaves the palace walls, and he sees in succession an old man, a sick man, a dying man, and a dead man. He sees all of this as part of life for the first time, because these truths have been concealed from him. But perhaps a Nietzschean critique would be that it is a mistake to treat the healthy way of living through a decline, the healthy approach to a time of decline, or the ideal way of facing death, as if this represents an ideal generally or represents health generally, or as if the purpose of our activity in life should be to learn to face death. If that's the goal of all your earthly activity, then in some sense, what is life for other than death? Life's meaning is made subordinate to the question of death, which is troublesome in and of itself. And what time is left to spend living and enjoying life, and pursuing great things, feeling the cornucopia of emotions that are possible and sensations that are possible in this world, living through the myriad experiences that are possible in a human life. The conclusion from Buddha's diagnosis is that all of these things are ultimately the cause of suffering and should be avoided. The desire for any of this experience, sensuous experience, feelings of pleasure or anything like this, they need to be detached from. And that suffering is not something that ends at death, because you'll continue to experience rebirth in accord with your karma, passing through the wheel of samsara and all its possible worlds, all these 6 ways of being reborn. So it's not enough to say that Nietzsche would have disagreed with the metaphysical claims of Buddhism. That in the same way, Nietzsche takes it just sort of as a starting axiom that heaven doesn't exist and the Christian God doesn't exist. He probably also would have taken it as a starting axiom that the 6 different worlds, or sometimes upwards of 30 worlds in the various cosmic Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and Devas and Asuras, probably he would have said those don't exist, right? So that much is obvious. But it's also a disagreement that is somewhat complicated by the idea of the eternal return. If you suffer in life, and that life recurs eternally, then indeed that person's suffering will be eternal. And therefore, finding detachment from one's desires, from one's ego, from their suffering would represent a kind of eternal liberation, albeit one that always has to be reaccomplished, recommenced. It has to be reached again in every lifetime. But we might say death doesn't get you out of the problems of life, either in Buddhism or in Nietzsche's philosophy. But for Nietzsche, the redemption of life can't ever lie outside of life. That was Schopenhauer's answer. The goal of all religious paths is to negate the will, and with it to negate the reality of the world of representation. So it's a negation of life. And this is ultimately why Nietzsche will always regard Buddhism as a pessimistic religion and even as a nihilistic religion, because it makes the ethical determination that it would have been better not to have been, to crib Benevitar's phrase. Schopenhauer makes this claim explicit in his philosophy. In Buddhism, it is perhaps less explicit. We can get an intimation of the idea insofar as the Buddhist sees existence itself as a kind of a result of an error of perception, as a delusion, and it is maintained by selfish craving, by hateful aversion, and when you achieve clarity, when you have recognition of the truth, oftentimes in the West we use the term enlightenment, although that term is fraught with connotative baggage that we should be careful not to include in this context. But the Buddhist notion is that they will realize that separate individuated existence, phenomenal existence itself, is fundamentally empty, impermanent, and unsatisfactory. Nothing in the whole world, in this whole cosmos of worlds, is satisfactory. And so the justification for life for the Buddhist can't lie within life, whereas for Nietzsche, it can't lie outside of it. Nietzsche fundamentally differs with them then almost as a kind of axiomatic position. And it's worth saying that it can't really be anything other than that. Because here we are dealing with a question of worth. What is a worldly existence worth? What is the value of the world? Nietzsche addresses this question in The Gay Science number 346, quote, "We take good care not to say that the world is of less value. It seems to us at present absolutely ridiculous when man claims to devise values to surpass the values of the actual world. It is precisely from that point that we have retraced our steps, as from an extravagant error of human conceit and irrationality, which for a long period has not been recognized as such. This error had its last expression in modern pessimism, an older and stronger manifestation in the teaching of Buddha. But Christianity also contains it, more dubiously to be sure, and more ambiguously, but nonetheless seductive on that account. The whole attitude of man versus the world, man as world-denying principle, man as the standard of the value of things, as judge of the world, who in the end puts existence itself on his scales and finds it too light. The monstrous impertinence of this attitude has dawned upon us as such and has disgusted us. We now laugh when we find man and world placed beside one another, separated by the sublime presumption of the little word and. But how is it? Have we not in our very laughing just made a further step in despising mankind, and consequently also in pessimism, in despising the existence cognizable by us? End quote. Typical complication that Nietzsche raises there. So, of course, the irony that Nietzsche draws out is that man is the measurer of all things. It seems as though it is the norm for us to make judgments and evaluations of worth. Furthermore, it seems that it is the norm for that evaluation to find the value of existence wanting. And he says that all of this is absolutely ridiculous to us now. This is one of the stranger ideas that I have often touched upon, the idea of health as the exception and sickliness as the norm. So the ordinary way of evaluating the world is, if not itself a pure devaluation, it's something that leads to it. For all moralizations of the world eventually turn to condemnations, as we find, Nietzsche says this earlier in The Gay Science, that life, nature, history, and so on are all rather immoral. But if that is the norm, the ordinary thing for mankind to do, and we Nietzscheans judge man for this, the ordinary thing for him to do is to judge and condemn the world, right? The ordinary thing is sickness. But are we not then despising the world by despising mankind? Are we not passing a judgment on the world cognizable by us and therefore condemning it? We don't know existence itself. We only know an existence cognizable by the human mind, and we don't cognize the world without imposing valuations on it. That's part of the entire process of cognition. One could argue, from a Nietzschean standpoint, it's actually the point of cognition, to calculate from the unsatisfactory to the satisfactory, from want to abundance, from bad to good, and so on. That's what the impulses, the drives do. They make a valuation and make that calculation. It is so inseparable from the process of cognition that we almost can't imagine a form of cognition without it, without that element of judgment. And thus the only existence that we know, the only world we know, is a world full of our own valuations, or rather patterned by those valuations. And if we, the critical philosophical type, find the ordinary type of valuation wanting, we're committing the same offense that we accuse them of doing when they pose the dichotomy of man versus the world. As we all know, Nietzsche said in an earlier section of The Gay Science, "I do not want to accuse. I do not even want to accuse the accusers." So ultimately, a thoroughly consistent perspectival approach can really judge nothing in the sense of passing judgment. At least it can never claim to judge impartially. It can only judge from the standpoint of its own prejudices. It doesn't, in other words, set itself aside as man and world, man standing aside from the world, but sees itself as a perspective that is contained within that world, an extremely limited perspective, patterned by its time and place within that world. And ultimately, Nietzsche's standpoint is that the world is innocent, and if that is the case, that even those who would declare the world guilty, they too are innocent. So, the reason I wanted to just work through the complications in that passage is because, yes, Nietzsche is saying we can't judge people for judging and condemning the world. We can't condemn them for condemning. But this is not an affirmation of those who judge and condemn the world. In fact, we are going to become so free from their manner of condemning things that we won't even condemn them for their condemnations. So it's not condemning those who judge and condemn, but not affirming them either. In a way, it's just passing by them. And of course, Buddhism is mentioned in that passage. And to return to the question of Buddhism, the interesting aspect here is that it is included among the pessimistic views of the world, which Nietzsche says includes Christianity, but remarkably, even Christianity is more ambiguous in its pessimism than Buddhism is. Why would that be? Well, because the notion of a perfect existence haunts Christianity, so to speak. The ideal way of living that is described in the Garden of Eden is promised to return after the day of judgment. The communion that man has broken off with God will be reestablished. Unlike in Buddhism, in which existence itself is a kind of delusion, a kind of mistake, brought about by an inexplicable clouding over of the clarity of formlessness, one which stretches back to time without beginning, and from which one can only be promised liberation, a liberation from existence, from phenomenal existence, from form, from willing, from the delusion of selfhood, and so on. In Christianity, we might say there is a blessed, eternal, perfect existence on both sides of earthly life, so to speak. Earthly life itself is really just a kind of interruption of a subpar, cursed existence subject to death, an interruption of that into this perfect existence. But on either side, it isn't formlessness, it's not extinguishment, as we might translate nirvana, but eternality, perfection. In Christianity, life itself isn't unsatisfactory. We, in some sense, our sin is what makes it unsatisfactory. We experience an unsatisfactory form of life because of original sin. And a satisfactory form of life is what is promised at the end of overcoming sin. True life, which is life in Jesus Christ, life in the Holy Spirit, that is what the Christian aims for. And so from that angle, Buddhism is arguably more, quote-unquote, pessimistic, because life or individuated existence is inherently unsatisfactory. There's no form of it that will be satisfactory. And there's no such thing as an eternal existence either. Nietzsche's highly contentious third option is to simply be affirming of an earthly existence, to affirm, to justify, to redeem existence as it is, which means in a strange way to be satisfied with dissatisfaction, because that is what characterizes life. It would also mean to be at peace with the eternal recurrence of war and peace, as Nietzsche calls it in the section entitled Excelsior. To accept the fact that you will live through things and experience things that will be impossible to accept. The deaths of loved ones and horrible terminal illnesses, tragedies in which the best among us are destroyed. And like Christianity and like Buddhism, Nietzsche's philosophy promotes its own metaphysical interpretation of the world in the aforementioned eternal recurrence, in which all that is within this impermanence is itself eternal, always recurring ad infinitum, and in which there is no way out, therefore, of embodied life. All there is this existence, and there is not even a hope of negating it after death. Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil 3, part 56, quote, "Whoever, like myself, prompted by some enigmatical desire, has long endeavored to go to the bottom of the question of pessimism and free it from the half-Christian, half-German narrowness and stupidity in which it has finally presented itself to this century, namely in the form of Schopenhauer's philosophy, whoever with an Asiatic and super-Asiatic eye has actually looked inside and into the most world-renouncing of all possible modes of thought, beyond good and evil, and no longer like Buddha and Schopenhauer, under the dominion and delusion of morality. Whoever has done this has perhaps just thereby, without really desiring it, opened his eyes to behold the opposite ideal, the ideal of the most world-approving, exuberant, and vivacious man, who has not only learnt to compromise and arrange with that which was and is, but wishes to have it again as it was and is, and for all eternity, insatiably calling out da capo, not only to himself, but to the whole piece and play, and not only the play, but actually to him who requires the play, and makes it necessary, because he always requires himself anew, and makes himself necessary. What? Would this not be circulus viciosus Deus?" End quote. And the last phrase is God as the vicious circle. Da capo is a musical term meaning from the beginning, as we say sometimes at rehearsal, from the top. The song is completed and it is simply played again. This is what it means to embrace Nietzsche's valuation of the world and to say yes to existence. That's what it truly means. To really put your money where your mouth is, to wager on this existence, on this life and no other life, you'd have to affirm the belief, or at least affirm the possibility that this life recurs eternally just as it is. That would be both the toughest pill to swallow and the most enlivening, should one manage to gulp it down. And that would mean to truly want it again as it was and is. We have a common saying which alludes to such an attitude. I would do it all over again. Whenever someone utters such a phrase, whenever someone speaks like this, that if given the choice to go back and retry some earlier part of my life, to relive some episode within my life, I would do it all the same. I'd wish simply to experience the same thing over and over again, not to redo it. Most of us have moments like that we would want to relive, but most of us also have moments that you wish you could do differently. You could have done differently. What would it take for someone to wish for their entire life to return to them, to say I would do absolutely nothing differently? And, Nietzsche says that the test is sort of, have you ever had a high moment? A moment so exalted that you would be willing to put the entirety of your life back on the table for the sake of that moment. What would it take for someone to wish their entire life to return? To say I would do nothing differently? There would have to be some moments there that were worth the cost that was paid in terms of the other unsatisfactory moments. And again, this is part of Nietzsche's arguments about fate, the interrelatedness of every phenomenal part to the whole. In some sense, they're not really parts at all. Neither is there a whole. There's only forces that are bound by rigorous necessities, and if you change one thing, you change the whole tapestry. Again, if pressed for reasons as to why we ought to affirm life instead of seek to negate it, Nietzsche can't give us an answer. What his philosophy can do is assign a certain physiological condition or a certain physiological assessment, a certain diagnosis of each answer. He can only tell us, in other words, what they mean. He can't tell us whether we ought to affirm or negate, because we have to treat these valuations as symptoms. And as such, neither judgment can be correct. Quote, judgments and valuations of life, whether for or against, cannot be true. Their only value lies in the fact that they are symptoms. They can be considered only as symptoms. Per se, such judgments are nonsense. You must therefore endeavor by all means to reach out and try to grasp this astonishingly subtle axiom that the value of life cannot be estimated. A living man cannot do so because he is a contending party, or rather the very object in the dispute, and not a judge. Nor can a dead man estimate it, for other reasons. End quote. I love that last line. That's from Twilight of Idols. So now, if we reflect on this perspective, we will find here too that Nietzsche is at variance with Buddhism, because the Buddhist position would be that there is a right view and a wrong view to take in regard to the question of existence. For all their skepticism regarding the substantial existence of phenomena, for example, Buddhists are not really skeptics, or they're not really quote-unquote postmodern, especially regarding these ethical judgments. The true scope and the depth of suffering that exists, the Buddhists would argue, can't be justified by any amount of pleasure or joy. And anyone who would be as blasé as Nietzsche is about the realities of suffering, treating it as a kind of price to be paid for the affirmation of existence, simply has the wrong view, because he has not really comprehended how much suffering there is to be had in life. And to get a sense for this, I want to read one of the most powerful of the Pali Canon's sutras, in my opinion, one of the most powerful, at least among the passages that I have read, which, to be fair, is a small minority of the total corpus, which is huge. But this is the Asu Sutra, contained in the Samyutta Nikaya. It's also an explanation of why the Buddhists find a human life to be so valuable. Quote, at Savatthi, there the Blessed One said, from an inconstruable beginning comes transmigration. A beginning point is not evident, though beings hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving are transmigrating and wandering on. What do you think, monks? Which is the greater, the tears you have shed while transmigrating and wandering this long, long time, crying and weeping from being joined with what is displeasing, being separated from what is pleasing, or the water in the four great oceans? As we understand the Dharma, taught to us by the Blessed One, this is the greater, the tears we have shed while transmigrating and wandering this long, long time, crying and weeping from being joined with what is displeasing, being separated from what is pleasing, not the water in the four great oceans. Excellent, monks, excellent. It is excellent that you thus understand the Dharma taught by me. This is the greater, the tears you have shed while transmigrating and wandering this long, long time, not the water in the four great oceans. Long have you repeatedly experienced the death of a mother. The tears you have shed over the death of a mother while transmigrating and wandering this long, long time are greater than the water in the four great oceans. Long have you experienced the death of a father, the death of a brother, the death of a sister, the death of a son, the death of a daughter, loss with regard to relatives, loss with regard to wealth, loss with regard to disease, the tears you have shed over loss with regard to disease while transmigrating and wandering this long, long time, crying and weeping from being joined with what is displeasing, being separated from what is pleasing, are greater than the water in the four great oceans. Why is that? From an inconstruable beginning comes transmigration. A beginning point is not evident, though beings hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving are transmigrating and wandering on. Long have you thus experienced stress, experienced pain, experienced loss, swelling the cemeteries, enough to become disenchanted with all fabricated things, enough to become dispassionate, enough to be released." End quote. The obvious point is that you've suffered an unimaginable amount across your lifetimes, stretching, if not infinitely, incomprehensibly back in time. Buddhist metaphysics sometimes likes to deny the distinction between finite and infinite when it comes to such matters. We'll leave that aside. That's a point that Nietzsche will take up. He has a whole discussion of the sort of philosophy of time that comes out of his Buddhist worldview, but a Buddhist worldview that interacts with Western metaphysics. Very interesting book, but we'll get to that in the episodes on Nietzsche. It's not really important because it's such a huge number of lifetimes that it clearly represents an incomprehensible enormity of suffering, and that can be multiplied by all the sentient beings in existence, which are also numberless. Now, as if oceans of tears is not a powerful enough image, there's another sutra I'm not going to read because it says basically the same thing, but instead here the Buddha says there have been oceans of blood shed by you in the past. You incarnated as a sheep, and a butcher cut your sheep head off so that he could enjoy some mutton. And you incarnated maybe as a man in a past life. Maybe you were beheaded in battle. Maybe you were beheaded because you were an adulterer. And maybe you were incarnated as, just a wild deer, and you shed your blood when a predator found you, and so on and so forth. There's more blood that's been shed in your total lifetimes than all the water in the oceans. And so the Buddhist salvation is to be released from all of this. It's not a trivial thing. The true scope of suffering is really quite grotesque. And so if you perceive that, if you have the right view of it, you will be released from these lives of attachment, in which you always come to be joined to, attached to what is displeasing, and always separated from that which is pleasing, and weep over what you have lost. When Nietzsche thumbs his nose at those who have set man against the world, or in some way sought to make this divide between man and nature, place man as the judge above nature, here too the Buddhist is of a different opinion. And, we have to add the caveat that Nietzsche recognizes this is a human, all too human bit of folly. Even he himself has to practice it in order to cognize the world. And, in a very general sense, I could see someone making the argument that man is not set against the world in Buddhism, because in Buddhism, all has to be seen as interconnected. There's nothing separate. Dependent origination, we've discussed all this before. And yet, a human birth is, for the Buddhist, a very valuable and rare thing, because Humanity is qualitatively different from nature because it's the only type of being capable of becoming liberated. And we spoke about that a bit last time, about practicing the middle path of Buddhism. Only human beings are really capable of that kind of equanimity that's required to follow the Noble Eightfold Path, which is the remedy, the prescription for our suffering. And even most of us humans seem incapable of doing it. But nevertheless, this does designate that a human lifetime is the most valuable thing. It's a type of existence with a unique importance in the cosmos. And thus, this represents in a strange way a similar kind of affirmation of life, as Nietzsche would have it. Because it's an affirmation in that only humans have the capacity to negate life, to negate the will, as Schopenhauer would have understood it. Only human beings, as Nietzsche saw things, will set themselves aside from the world in order to pass judgments on it. And the scales always come up too light, right? So that's exactly what Nietzsche says, that in some sense the Buddhists say, yes, that's true. Only human beings have the capacity to do that. But that's necessary because to negate life is exactly what is needed. To return to Buddhist scripture, there's another passage that illustrates this unique importance of humanity. This is from the Nakasika Sutra. Quote, at Savatthi, then the Buddha, picking up a little bit of sand on his fingernail, addressed the bhikkhus. What do you think, bhikkhus? Which is more, this little bit of sand on my fingernail or this great earth? Bhante, the great earth is far more. The little bit of sand on your fingernail is tiny. Compared to the great earth, those cannot be compared or even imagined. It is not even a significant fraction. In the same way, bhikkhus, sentient beings, reborn as humans, are few as this bit of sand on my fingernail. But those not reborn as humans are many as the sand on this great earth. Therefore you should strive diligently and without delay to end this suffering in the rebirth process. End quote. So it's imperative that liberation be achieved with your valuable human birth, or at least that you enter the stream, as Buddhists say. In Theravada, they say that once you begin to practice the Buddhist path, it's assured that you only have 7 lifetimes ahead of you. I think according to some formulations, maybe it's 4 lifetimes. But, your liberation is a multi-lifetime process, but you can at least be assured now that you've entered the stream, you will practice Buddhism in all of your subsequent lives. And you will have the good fortune to continue being reborn as a human with access to the Dharma, right? Later forms of Buddhism, especially in the Mahayana, sometimes involve the prospect of achieving Buddhahood in a single lifetime or going to the Pure Land, as we talked about, where practicing the Dharma is easy. But that makes things naturally much more complicated, though, once we get into the Mahayana spontaneous enlightenment idea. I mean, there were literally centuries of debate about this that broke open because of that whole prospect in, for example, Zen Buddhism. So we'll leave that aside. Another variance between Nietzsche's philosophy and the views of Buddhism, therefore, involve causality. As mentioned last time, the entirety of the Buddhist doctrine really only makes sense within the framework of causality because of the law of karma and the idea of your actions being the cause of karmic consequences that continue you in the field or the cycle of rebirth. But Buddhism also depends on the doctrine of free will. And this is another thing that Nishitani will discuss in his book and that we'll talk about in a future episode. But you could say that Buddhism is compatibilist in this way, that it affirms causality and it affirms free will at the same time. As I've often described Nietzsche, in some ways he's like the inverse. He says it's neither one nor the other. Now, again, when you get into Buddhist styles of logic, like Nagarjuna, there's like the 4 ways of stating any proposition, and they would say that it's both and neither nor. So, Buddhists always try to have things both ways. That's what non-dualistic religions try to do. But so in that sense, at least, there's a sort of convergence between Nietzsche's view of free will and causality and that of the Buddhists. But I think we'll see, it's really when it comes to their prescriptions, that there's this huge divergence, that whether you can find these sort of superficial similarities in the way that they take on this question, they interpret the implications, I guess you could say, in very different ways. In the West, the classical distinction that's made between libertarian free will and hard determinism, and there are all these gradations in between it, right? And including, for example, compatibilism, as we mentioned, or soft determinism. But these approaches are by their nature a mediation between these two mutually exclusive extremes. Either the will is totally free and arbitrary in its decisions, or the decisions of one's will are determined totally by past causes. Or in the third case, the philosopher gives us a description in which these two apparent opposites are each given their due, even though they technically are mutually exclusive propositions. But Nietzsche's position, especially as a later philosopher, is a rejection of all causalism of any kind. And that means even the causalism of the will itself. So he doesn't reject causalism in order to simply reject determinism, but also the notion of free will. It's not as though the doctrine of cause and effect stands naturally in opposition to the doctrine of free will from Nietzsche's perspective, as something that would refute it. Rather, free will depends on the very notion of the will acting as a cause. It depends on the idea that the ego can be the cause of effects that we then call actions. And so Nietzsche ends up rejecting both free will and determinism, insofar as he rejects cause and effect, as a sort of ontological claim, or we might say a negative, an anti-ontological claim. There is no basis for positing causality as a kind of ontological truth. From Nietzsche's perspective, philosophically. We only know causality as part of the cognizable world of experience. It's a principle that we bring to bear on the interpretation of existence, without which the world would simply be incomprehensible. We've discussed this idea in great detail in the podcast in the past. I'm obviously leaving many of the nuances aside, but we talked about it, the episode on the Four Great Errors from Twilight of Idols. We also looked at Hume's critique of causality in comparison with Nietzsche's view. That episode was last season, so you can go back and look to that episode for a more thorough explanation. But if we look to the Four Great Errors and look to that passage, Nietzsche makes it clear where he thinks this idea really comes from. It can be explained naturalistically as part of a process by which man is socialized or tamed by the civilizing process. Causalism in Nietzsche's view derives from the free will doctrine, that is, we come to believe in cause and effect, from first deriving that the will, the intention, is the cause of action, and we come to that belief for the purposes of making people responsible for their actions. We want to make people responsible for their actions to justify punishing them. Quote, "The doctrine of the will was invented principally for the purpose of punishment, that is to say, with the intention of tracing guilt. The whole of ancient psychology, or the psychology of the will, is the outcome of the fact that its originators, who were the priests at the head of ancient communities, wanted to create for themselves a right to administer punishments, or the right for God to do so. Men were thought of as free in order that they might be judged and punished, in order that they might be held guilty. Consequently, every action had to be regarded as voluntary, and the origin of every action had to be imagined as lying in consciousness." End quote. Aside from the social and political and ethical implications of what Nietzsche is claiming here, there's an interesting implication for his view of causality. Cause and effect, whenever we see it in the broader world of nature, external to ourselves, external to humanity, is one giant anthropomorphism, derived from our sense that our quote-unquote will, our conscious intentions, basically our consciousness, our ego, is effective, it's determinative, it can make sovereign decisions. And so Nietzsche says when we first tried to understand nature, we projected ourselves into nature, and we did so by personifying it and by therefore seeing an ego with intentions in inanimate things, in wild nature. In other words, when the river floods and destroys the village, ancient man might have attributed such an event to the will of a god. The river god is enacting his wrath, or whatever such explanation. Nietzsche therefore argues that when Schopenhauer took the will to be the most fundamental and obvious truth, he was simply recapitulating to the most ancient prejudice that saw a will in a literal personal sense in every nook and cranny of existence, even the inorganic world. It was a form of crude metaphor that we used in order to give sense to a chaotic existence. But the belief itself tells us nothing about the world, it only tells us about ourselves. In any case, Buddhism agrees that causality and free will go hand in hand, interestingly enough. Buddhism rejects mechanistic views of the world and hard determinism in which the sovereignty, the individual decision-making power of man vanishes, because the Buddhist practitioner has to be held by the doctrine to actually have power over whether he pursues desire or attempts to uproot his desire and seek the negation of desire. All of this has to be conceived as within the power of the practitioner. It has to be something that is subject to his will, or else the entire the premise of the Buddha, the great physiologist, giving us his diagnosis and his prescription, that would be futile in some sense if we have no power over it. And the Buddhist doctrine recognizes this depends on the doctrine of causality as well, as much as on the idea of the individual's freedom, insofar as one's practice of the path causes their liberation from suffering, right? Whereas following one's karma will see you continuing to be reborn into samsara, and how the opportunities and challenges and what you face now is all conditioned by past causes. So both are affirmed. The thing that Nietzsche sees as hand in hand, and therefore something to be rejected, the Buddhist says, no, they do go hand in hand, but we affirm them on that basis. And, it should be noted that on many questions of philosophical outlook, the Buddha is often mediating between extremes, or saying, again, neither this nor that. The way that you conceptualize things, they're in some sense, all of them are wrong, because our whole language, our whole way of conceiving, the whole field of rational understanding and conceptualization is a falsification of the world to begin with. But there are certain doctrinal questions where the Buddha is very clear that you have to view things a certain way, that this does constitute the right view of things, and there is a wrong view of things, right? Again, a way in which the Buddhists are not totally skeptical or totally deconstructionist of everything, even though it can seem like that from a Western perspective, or maybe a vulgar Western reading of Buddhism. But on causality, this is one of those cases where it has to be affirmed. We can look to the Majjhima Nikaya, which is in the Panaka Sutra, and I'll read an excerpt from it, heavily abridged, on the section on causality. Quote, "Because there actually is causality, the view of one who thinks there is no causality is his wrong view. Because there actually is causality, when he has resolved that there is no causality, that is the wrong resolve. And because there actually is causality, when he speaks the statement there is no causality, that is his wrong speech. With regard to this, an observant person considers thus: if there is no causality, then, with the breakup of the body after death, this venerable person has made himself safe. But if there is causality, then this venerable person, on the breakup of the body after death, will reappear in a plane of deprivation, a bad destination, a lower realm, hell. Now, householders of those contemplatives and Brahmins who hold this doctrine, hold this view, there is causality, there is requisite condition for the defilement of beings. It's not the case that all living beings, all life, all beings, all souls are powerless, devoid of strength, devoid of effort, or that subject to the changes of fate, serendipity, and nature they experience pleasure and pain in the 6 great classes of birth. It can be expected that, shunning these 3 unskillful activities, bad bodily conduct, bad verbal conduct, bad mental conduct, they will adopt and practice these 3 skillful activities: good bodily conduct, good verbal conduct, good mental conduct. Why is that? Because those venerable contemplatives and Brahmins see in unskillful activities the drawbacks, the degradation, and the defilement, and in skillful activities the rewards of renunciation, resembling cleansing. With regard to this, an observant person considers thus: if there is causality, then this venerable person, on the breakup of the body after death, will reappear in a good destination, a heavenly world." End quote. And this discourse on causality and its relationship to karma and rebirth would become very important in the Zen tradition, because, of course, in Mahayana, we have this form is emptiness, emptiness is form, new philosophical orientation, where things are sort of affirmed and denied at the same time. And causality is even brought into that. And there's this very nuanced koan, one of the cases, called Baizhang's Wild Fox. And in the episodes on Nishitani, we'll talk about that koan more. But this is just a key issue in Buddhism. And we can see here that in this sutra, that causality is certainly affirmed, as is freedom of the will. In fact, in some of the sections I didn't read in my abridgment, the Buddha actually says that advocating against causality is not only unskillful, it's actually evil. I mean, you probably already gathered that because he says it could land you in hell, but it's not a sort of, it's not a sort of crime where it's just, ignorance before the law is no excuse. It's not just ignorance. It is an evil act to tell people there is no causality because you're deceiving people. You're endangering them with that teaching. But likewise, it is not the case that living beings are powerless, that they're merely subject to past causes and conditions. They're not subject to the whims of fate and coincidence. They have power over their actions. They are the cause which affects their actions. Those actions are the cause of their karma. The consequences of those actions have to be inherited in this life or the next. And one can adopt good conduct, can resolve to do so, as Buddha says. So causality and free will are, again, recognized as unified here. And the question of determinism, from what I can understand, is never really seriously entertained in the Buddhist texts. Insofar as there's no attempt to provide a logical proof for free will or to engage in a kind of philosophical disputation. That kind of approach to doctrine is usually seen as wrong-headed in Buddhism. Buddha is often dismissing the wisdom of the philosophers, their so-called wisdom. I think, once again, the Buddhist would have recourse to a rather powerful empirical argument. He would say, try the practice, and you will see that it causes you to suffer less. You will perceive, you will gain a right view of the power of the causative power of your resolve to actually address the problem of suffering. You will see that it makes you more morally upright, and it delivers you from painful cravings and longings, and it delivers you to a sense of equanimity. When you take the medicine, it causes a result, and we know by experience that this is the case. And even though you may have to take it on the authority of the wise, of the arahants and the bodhisattvas and the saints, as we talked about in that passage where Buddha's talking to Sariputra, you have to take it on faith that the practice works before you will even have an impetus to try it. But once you do experience it, you will know empirically for yourself. And so if one were to argue, well, the Buddhists don't really have a good, justification that from an ontological point of view, they can't really justify causality, that is somewhat irrelevant from the Buddhist point of view. They would say, well, we've identified the problem, the sickness, which is suffering. Here's the cure. Take it or don't. But the argument critiquing causality is rather irrelevant in the practical matter of relieving suffering. And here I'm reminded of another ancient Greek sect. The Pyrrhonists, also known as the Pyrrhonians, are the school of skeptics. And I've said several times in this episode that the Buddhists are not really skeptics, quote unquote, in that there are doctrines in Buddhism, right? But there's an interesting comparison to be made here. The school was founded by Pyrrho, but the most significant surviving writings of the school come to us from Sextus Empiricus. And as you can probably guess from his name, Sextus Empiricus is associated with empiricism, but empiricism as a school of medicine. In those days, that's how empiricism begins, as a school of medicine. And there were various philosophies on medicine in the Hellenistic Greek world. The empirical school derived its diagnosis by following the available evidence, which was cross-referenced with past experience, past precedents, in order to come by the most likely cause of the illness. The other views were things like you just look at the symptoms at hand, you don't look at past precedent. There were other approaches to medicine. But we discussed, albeit briefly, the link between medicine and Pyrrhonic skepticism in the episode we did on Pyrrho and on the ancient skeptics more generally, again in the previous season. In Hellenistic philosophy, Buddhism is often compared with both Stoicism and Pyrrhonism, which is, there's a sense to both of those comparisons. But one interpretation you could take of Nietzsche's writing would be that skepticism is more akin to Buddhism, whereas Stoicism is probably more akin to Christianity than it is to Buddhism. Epicurean philosophy, too, with its negative hedonism, can also be placed adjacent to Buddhism. But at one place in Daybreak, Nietzsche compares Stoicism to self-torture. Whereas the Epicurean tries to reduce his exposure to suffering, the Stoic tries to endure it. And he likes to do so with an audience, before a public, to swallow shards of glass and scorpions. And in another place in Beyond Good and Evil, a rather famous passage, Nietzsche calls Stoicism self-tyranny. That self-tyrannizing that is required in training yourself to endure pain, to conquer pain. He overcomes his sensitivity through a confrontation with suffering, whereas meanwhile, again, as we've said, the Epicurean attempts to remove himself from the causes of suffering. He endeavors not to suffer in the first place. Skepticism also has this central theme of adiaphora, indifference. If there is a central pragmatic claim of the skeptics, it is that living according to this principle of adiaphora, saying to oneself always, in every situation, it could go this way, it could go the other way, either way is fine with me, I'm indifferent to whatever outcome, then you can achieve ataraxy. Ataraxia, usually translated as tranquility, freedom from stress, freedom from care. As we've talked about before, the strange consequence of a skeptical outlook is often a kind of conservatism. And I mean that in the most general sense possible. We see this tendency not only in Pyrrho, but also in Michel de Montaigne, in David Hume. I think Montaigne puts it best: the skeptic does not put any stock in human intellect and its ability to grasp the truth. And so he has no grounds to challenge, for example, the traditions and creeds which he receives from the religion of his fathers. He would probably do well simply to follow those creeds. David Hume as well. He similarly critiques causality and argues that we have no empirical basis whatsoever for positing it. It can't be demonstrated either as a logical necessity. We affirm it as a matter of custom or habit. As a practical matter, he says, he can't doubt cause and effect. He sort of accepts the immediate truth of it that he just received, that he thinks of as sort of just a kind of customary thing. It's a habit that we develop from the time that we're infants. That he says that what I knew when I was not even out of my crib, philosophers, grown men can't even justify logically. So all of us have a knowledge of causality long before we can give reasons for it. And similarly, Pyrrhonists were said to argue that far from being hostile to the ethical creeds and traditions that they receive, they follow the customs and the laws. And more than this, their skepticism takes the practical form of, again, a kind of epistemological or phenomenological conservatism. And this is how Diogenes Laertius describes this particular aspect of Pyrrhonism. Quote, Timon, in his Python, says that Pyrrho does not destroy the authority of custom. And in his images he speaks thus, quote, but whatever is evidently seen prevails, wherever it may be. And in his treatise on the senses he says, the reason why a thing is sweet I do not declare, but I confess the fact of sweetness is evident. So too, Anicedemus, in the first book of his Pyrrhonian Discourses, says that Pyrrho defines nothing dogmatically on account of the possibility of contradiction, but that he is guided by what is evident. End quote. The reason why we've taken this detour into ancient Greek philosophy again is because, for one, I think many of these philosophies inform how Nietzsche understands Buddhism, in addition to being, I think, from my perspective, my interpretation, a valid comparison to make. But I think we can see by analogy the way in which the Buddhist affirms causality and freedom of the will and the effectiveness of his doctrine. We don't need a logical proof that something is sweet, as Timon says. It is enough to have the sense experience of tasting the sweetness. But, of course, the pleasurable taste of sweet things is not what the Buddhists are focused on. They would say, so too, we do not need a logical justification for the existence of suffering. If you're in pain, you don't need it to be proved. You believe it in absentia of proof, as something immediately evident, and in some sense ontologically given just by its appearance, since it is at bottom a sensation. All we need to do to prove that a sensation exists is that we sense it. And like the Pyrrhonists, the Buddhists proceed according to what is evident. And in some sense, the suggestion of a A metaphysical justification for the evidence of the senses would be irrelevant in this case. And so again, we have to emphasize that point that it's not so important in Buddhism what you believe, except insofar as it affects your actions, whether it helps or hinders you in taking action to attain emancipation. You don't reach nirvana based on faith, based on belief, and you also don't reach it by establishing a philosophical justification for your conceptions. In actual fact, as Hume would have put it, we believe in all of these things in absentia of reasons. And this attitude is shared by Buddhism, and it gives it that pragmatic side, which allows it to do an end around some of these hairier metaphysical questions that could be rather difficult to settle on a logical basis. In light of all of this, I want to take a look at one of Nietzsche's notes in The Will to Power. This is number 437, and it will bring together this discussion of Pyrrho and Epicurus and the Buddha. And it will also, I think, open up the really deep issues for Nietzsche when it comes to the Buddhist evaluation of life. In this passage, Nietzsche begins by saying that he prefers the philosophers who taught prior to Socrates. It's a topic we've discussed a great deal, but he says, even though something changed with Socrates, and most of the later figures are rather insignificant, there are a few exceptions. He continues, quote, I can see only one original figure in those that came afterwards, a late arrival but necessarily the last, Pyrrho, the nihilist. His instincts were opposed to the influences which had become ascendant in the meantime, the Socratic school, Plato, and the artistic optimism of Heraclitus. Wise wariness, Pyrrho. To live humbly among the humble, devoid of pride, to live in the vulgar way, to honor and believe what everyone believes, to be on one's guard against science and intellect and against everything that puffs one out, to be simply patient in the extreme, careless and mild, apathy, or better still, meekness, a Buddhist for Greece, bred amid the tumult of the schools, born after his time, weary, an example of the protest of weariness against the eagerness of the dialecticians, the incredulity of the tired man in regard to the importance of everything. He had seen Alexander. He had seen the Indian penitents. To such late arrivals and creatures of great subtlety, everything lowly, poor, and idiotic is seductive. It narcoticizes. It gives them relaxation. Pascal. On the other hand, they mix with the crowd and get confounded with the rest. These weary creatures need warmth, to overcome contradiction, to do away with contests, to have no will to excel in any way, to deny the Greek instincts. Pyrrho lived with his sister, who was a midwife. To rig out wisdom in such a way that it no longer distinguishes, to give it the ragged mantle of poverty, to perform the lowest offices, and to go to the market and sell sucking pigs. Sweetness, clearness, indifference, no need of virtues that require attitudes, to be equal to all even in virtue, final conquest of one's self, final indifference. Pyrrho and Epicurus, two forms of Greek decadence. They are related in their hatred of dialectics and all theatrical virtues. These two things together were then called philosophy. Pyrrho and Epicurus intentionally held that which they loved in low esteem. They chose common and even contemptible names for it, and they represented a state in which one is neither ill, healthy, lively, nor dead. Epicurus was more naive, more idyllic, more grateful. Pyrrho had more experience of the world, had traveled more, and was more nihilistic. His life was a protest against the great doctrine of identity. Happiness equals virtue equals knowledge. The proper way of living is not promoted by science. Wisdom does not make wise. The proper way of living does not desire happiness. It turns away from happiness. End quote. I think we can see here how even the criticism of Nietzsche comes with a kind of backhanded admiration. His interpretation of Pyrrho is not wholly negative. In fact, it doesn't even read to me as negative in its tone. But if you know the content of Nietzsche's philosophy, you can certainly see the criticism there, because Pyrrho is described as a nihilist, and we'll return to that point in a moment. What Nietzsche admires is that Pyrrho is a rebel against the reigning philosophical worldview, exemplified by the Academy of Plato, inherited from the Socratic faith in the identity of reason, virtue, and happiness. Pyrrho ultimately does not seek happiness. He turns away from it. He seeks indifference. He seeks tranquility apathy, meekness, a state which is neither happy nor unhappy. It's not the good life of Socrates. It's a skeptical attitude that there is any such thing, and that any path in life is any better than any other. Now, obviously, in that respect, he differs from the Buddhists, but in a very subtle way, the Buddhists do eventually produce some teachings that resemble this kind of thinking. Again, Zen Buddhism comes to mind. And I would argue that Chan in China, which eventually gives rise to Zen, often contains expressions of what we might call the path to Buddhahood through adiaphora. And this may seem like it produces a huge contradiction with the ethical teaching of Buddhism, because you're not supposed to be indifferent to the question of your salvation, right? And again, that's something that centuries of Buddhist commenters have attempted to disentangle and debate about. But nevertheless, true indifference here does not refer to some sort of like flippant state of disregard. Pyrrho was said to have been able to endure surgery without anesthesia, without crying out in pain, without even wincing. So we're talking about the kind of indifference here that could be compared to, for example, Bodhidharma meditating for 9 years, indifferent to the fact that his legs had rotted off. We're talking about total detachment from the consequences to oneself and even one's own body, even to the greatest pain. And in this way, indifference becomes a means to conquer oneself, as Nietzsche puts it, to endure any shame or embarrassment, any hardship or privation without care. The other parallels, Pyrrho is born after centuries of dispute between different philosophical schools, just as Buddha was. We talked about that in the previous episode. And like the Buddha, he doesn't have a care for any of them. He doesn't think that intellectualizing will ever reach the truth. And so his skepticism inevitably takes the form of a practical remedy to the problems of life. And, I mean, most importantly, Nietzsche just comes out and says it. He says Pyrrho is a Buddhist for Greece. I think those are the ways in which I would make a case for Pyrrho being a Buddhist for Greece. But however impressive this approach might be, we might have a sneaking admiration for the originality of Pyrrho at a time when everyone's just a carbon copy or a caricature of what came before, and his sort of active rejection of the Socratic ethical worldview, and what Nietzsche calls here the artistic optimism of Heraclitus. Ultimately, where does Pyrrhonism lead? His doctrine is nihilistic. All negative ethical doctrines eventually incline this way. Whether the goal of life is presented as a neutralization of harm, of evil or injustice or sin, or in the case of Buddhism, a neutralization of desire, which is the cause of our suffering existence, there's never anything positive at the end of it. Whenever a negative ethical doctrine arises on earth, there's never anything that ends up being affirmed on the other side of the negation or neutralization. The life path that is offered, even if it does prevent a kind of direct, immediate, and maybe suicidal nihilism by directing the practitioner's self-destructive ends into his practice, giving him something to do, a goal to attain, and so on. The end of that when one reaches that goal, the place that they reach is apathy. It's detachment. It's a state of non-action. It is also noteworthy in this passage that the artistic outlook of Heraclitus is brought up. And, that kind of interpretation, what does he call him, an artistic optimist? Might be rather specific to Nietzsche. I mean, Heraclitus has been interpreted in so many ways. And even the meaning of calling him an optimist here, I mean, it's probably clear to many of you who are longtime listeners of the podcast, but there's like a polysemous way in which Nietzsche uses language where optimism, when he's referring to Socrates, has a very different sense than when he's talking about Heraclitus here. At least we can infer that, right? But with this in mind, let's look to what he says elsewhere in Will to Power in 853, Art in the Birth of Tragedy, Part 2, quote, "Art and nothing else. Art is the great means of making life possible, the great seducer to life, the great stimulus of life. Art is the only superior counter-agent to all will to the denial of life. It is par excellence the anti-Christian, the anti-Buddhistic, the anti-nihilistic force. Art is the alleviation of the seeker after knowledge, of him who recognizes the terrible and questionable character of existence, who will recognize it, of the tragic seeker after knowledge. Art is the alleviation of the man of action, of him who not only sees the terrible and questionable character of existence, but also lives it, will live it, the tragic and warlike man, the hero. Art is the alleviation of the sufferer as the way to states in which pain is willed, is transfigured, is deified, where suffering is a form of great ecstasy. End quote. It's funny because that last line could be seen as exceedingly Christian in many ways, right? Especially if we look to the writing of Christian mystics. And it's like the terms in which Nietzsche will praise Buddhism as a logical religion or a more realistic religion of self-redemption, and one which does not indulge ressentiment or fanaticism the way Christianity does. Well, you could see transmuting suffering itself into a form of ecstasy as one of the trademark forms of Christian fanaticism. The love of martyrdom and the idea that suffering brings you closer to Christ and so on and so forth. I believe Teresa of the Cross, where she has these ecstatic visions of entering the wounds of Jesus Christ and licking his blood and being nourished by it, and all of these things. So, no one ever said that consistency was one of Nietzsche's virtues. It's not true that his philosophy is like totally chaotic and disorganized, but he likes to give us different angles and different perspectives on things, and sometimes it does produce like a true contradiction. But in practical terms, what Nietzsche was seeking in his principle for a new valuation was an impetus for activity, for affirmation. Valuation derives its significance from the kind of action it inspires. So it's important not only that evaluation be sufficiently motivating to inspire action, like in a proximal sense, but that the action that it inspires also has activity for its end. So the Buddhists do inspire action. The Buddhist valuations inspire action. But the conclusion of the course of Buddhism is passivity, and thus it's ultimately nihilistic. Nietzsche seeks for a great stimulant to life, as he sometimes writes, an enchantment to life that will make living ever more appealing, ever more seductive, ever more irresistible, whereas the world religions have steadily been making life less appealing, exhausting the will such that our experience of life is ever more deadened, flattened, tasteless. For Nietzsche, this is, in so many words, the greatest problem that humankind faces. Our highest values devalue themselves. And as we've already mentioned, every moralization of the world has produced a condemnation of it. We have adopted teachings that do inspire action, but actions which in themselves lead to the devaluation of action, detachment from the consequences of actions. In the same way, he called Christianity a kind of indirect nihilism that might have prevented an active nihilism from breaking out, a suicidal nihilism. Buddhism is much the same. We can look to Will to Power number 19, quote, every purely moral evaluation, as for instance the Buddhistic, terminates in nihilism. Europe must expect the same thing. It is supposed that one can get along with a morality bereft of a religious background, but in this direction the road to nihilism is opened. There is nothing in religion which compels us to regard ourselves as valuing creatures, end quote. And so much is packed into that little sentence there. We have, on the one hand, the sense in which the very disenchantment of the world, the desacralization of the world, poses a problem for our morality bereft of a religious background. That's what opens the road to nihilism. And the problem is that there's nothing in religion that has prepared us for the task. That's why, in some sense, we have to clear away morality before we can be ready for the task of reevaluating our values, because every such revaluation, every attempt to make man moral has relied upon thoroughly immoral means. And Nietzsche talks about this in regard to the great legislators of value, of which Buddha is one of them. Nietzsche makes another comparison between the Buddhists and the skeptics in Will to Power 458. This passage not only invokes the idea that the skeptics simply followed custom as a practical consideration, but it also gestures toward the passive nihilism in Buddhism, its opposition to action, as Nietzsche would put it. Quote, men must act, consequently rules of conduct are necessary. This is what even the ancient skeptics thought. The urgent need of a definite decision in this department of knowledge is used as an argument in favor of regarding something as true. Men must not act, said their more consistent brothers, the Buddhists, and then thought out a mode of conduct which would deliver man from the yoke of action. End quote. So the yoke of action, bondage within the need to act, the burden of action, the idea that there is anything valuable to pursue within the world of phenomena. That is precisely what the Buddhists reject. That's how we should understand action in this context. And we talked about it a little last time, but etymologically, right, what karma means is action, to make or to do. So in a literal sense, karma is Macht, as in the Wille zu Macht, the will to power. Power also meaning, in an important sense, action or doing. And so here we can see in really stark relief the key distinction between Buddhist and Nietzschean philosophy, the core of Nietzsche's polemic against Buddhism. Nietzsche affirms life. What is life? Well, in Zarathustra, he says that life itself is will to power. Life says, I am that which overcomes itself, which is sort of one of the ways of denoting the content of the will to power. It's an endless play of becoming and overcoming. And the governing principle, the principle through which we can understand it, the secret to the entire thing, is Will zu Macht. And so Nietzsche's affirmative attitude seeks action which makes new kinds of action possible. It is a valuation of life that permits or facilitates valuations, the valuing of things within life, valuations that facilitate further valuation. Whereas from the Buddhist standpoint, actions create karma, or rather karma is action, and actions have pleasurable and unpleasurable consequences, and therefore create a compensatory, equal and opposite consequence down the line. And to the extent that the Buddhist takes action, it's action that attempts to rid himself from karma, non-karmic action, action that doesn't generate karma. So at the end of the road of the course of action, the practical teaching of Buddhism, the practical ethical teaching is non-action, passivity. The point here is that Buddhism opposes activity in the sense of the pursuit, again, of worldly goals. It chooses passivity. The Buddhist would put it in different terms, though. They would say we're choosing cessation over karma. We are choosing to uproot the karmic seeds that bear these fruits of consequences, of future births. The point is to get out of action. Nietzsche recognizes this key difference, and he explains it wonderfully in Will to Power 155. Quote, in Buddhism, this thought prevails. All passions, everything which creates emotions and leads to blood, is a call to action. To this extent alone are its believers warned against evil. For action has no sense, it merely binds one to existence. All existence, however, has no sense. Evil is interpreted as that which leads to irrationalism, to the affirmation of means whose end is denied. A road to non-entity is the desideratum, hence all emotional impulses are regarded with horror. For instance, quote, on no account seek after revenge, be the enemy of no one. The hedonism of the weary finds its highest expression here. Nothing is more utterly foreign to Buddhism than the Jewish fanaticism of St. Paul. Nothing could be more contrary to its instinct than the tension, fire, and unrest of the religious man, and above all that form of sensuality which sanctifies Christianity with the name love. Moreover, it is the cultured and very intellectual classes who find blessedness in Buddhism, a race wearied and besotted by centuries of philosophical quarrels, but not beneath all culture, as those classes were from which Christianity sprang. In the Buddhistic ideal, there is essentially an emancipation from good and evil. A very subtle suggestion of a beyond to all morality is thought out in its teaching, and this beyond is supposed to be compatible with perfection, the condition being that even good actions are only needed pro tem, merely as a means, that is to say, in order to be free from all action. End quote. And you might have picked up that parts of this passage seem to have been adopted for the Antichrist, or were later developed into passages in the Antichrist. but he doesn't emphasize the opposition to action as sort of like the fundamental evil in the same way that he does here. So the hedonism of the weary, right? Buddhism is a negative hedonism, not hedonism in the colloquial sense, but in the philosophical sense. It's a calculation of value according to pleasure and pain. And rather than seeking pleasure, we avoid pain. Notice again the contrast with Christianity. Buddhism extinguishes fanaticism, whereas Christianity stokes it. It's another sort of admiring criticism because Buddhism in this way is beyond all morality, beyond good and evil. It has no concept of sin. It has no concept of crimes against God, an affront to the dignity of God, an affront to the dignity of this personal being who is a judge. Even its concept of good, really. Its concept of good is merely a means to free oneself from karma. It's purely consequentialist in that way. Maybe that's a vulgar way to put it, but I think you get the point. And we discussed all of this last time. If you listened to the previous episode, I think you should be following along with all of this rather easily. The significance, regarding, in terms of trying to really drill down into the essence of Nietzsche's critique of Buddhism, is this identification of it with nihilistic passivity. And, again, from a certain angle, that's preferable to Christianity's exacerbation of resentment and guilt and its fanaticism. I love how he says that the fact that it presents itself as a religion of love speaks to the sensualism that still endures within Christianity, whereas Buddhism is unambiguously unsensual. But it's also more unambiguously pessimistic and an altogether, therefore, more powerful seduction to what Nietzsche would call the will to nothingness. And in some of the other passages in Will to Power where Nietzsche fleshes this out, he's emphasizing the same themes. I'll just read a couple more of them, which I think will drive this point home and show his consistency in his interpretation. First, 179, quote, "Concerning the psychological problem of Christianity, the driving forces are resentment, popular insurrection, the revolt of the bungled and the botched. In Buddhism, it is different. It is not born of resentment. It rather combats resentment because the latter leads to action," end quote. And 342, where Nietzsche says that when, quote, "one takes the side of one's opponents in word and deed by means of a superfetation of peaceful, kindly, conciliatory, helpful, and loving states, one impoverishes the soil of the other states. That one is in need of unremitting practice. What is achieved thereby? The Buddhistic type, or the perfect cow. This point of view is possible only where no moral fanaticism prevails. That is to say, when evil is not hated on its own account, but because it opens the road to conditions which are painful, unrest, work, care, complications, dependence. This is the Buddhistic point of view. There is no hatred of sin. The concept sin, in fact, is entirely lacking," end quote. And so there at the end, there's the entire basis for Nietzsche's praise of Buddhism, which we discussed last time. But this is after he says that the Buddhistic type is the perfect cow, perhaps the most insulting thing he has said about Buddhists thus far. And why is that? Well, because the Buddhist ends up affirming the herd morality by simply recapitulating with the customs and laws of those around him. He does nothing to resist, to critique, destroy, or challenge anything. And it's interesting to consider the way that Nietzsche described Jesus. He says that resist not evil is the key to the entire gospel. Jesus is this hypersensitive type who lives in a total denial of reality, and thus there's no need to resist any evil on earth because, in some sense, this earth isn't even real. It is of a lesser reality than the imminent kingdom of heaven. The important point is the distinction between Christ and Christians in this respect, because it's the famous line, "There was only one Christian and he died on the cross." Those who converted to the religion of Jesus didn't live in that same imminent rejection of the world that Jesus did. Jesus doesn't strive or struggle against the world or its evil ways. He allows for his own death willingly. Now, according to Christian doctrine, of course, that's an act of sacrifice. That's a conquest over the evil in the world, a conquest of sin and death. But Nietzsche doesn't interpret it the same way. He interprets Jesus physiologically, again, with almost an axiomatic atheism. What concerns us here is not how the act was interpreted, but the difference between Christ and his followers and their inner states. One could extrapolate from that passage in Will to Power that Buddhism is perhaps maybe even a better course of instruction as to how to resist not evil than the example of Christ. Because again, remember the passage we talked about last time where Christianity promises everything but fulfills nothing. Buddhism promises nothing but fulfills everything. And so in the end, when I say that it recapitulates to the herd morality, Buddhism ends up being really no different from Christianity, again, because as Nietzsche says, they're both nihilistic religions, they're both decadence religions, and they both share the same high valuation of pity or compassion. In Christianity, it is a commandment. We are called to love our neighbors. To do otherwise would be a sin against God. So love your neighbor for God's sake. Nietzsche has some comments on that and Beyond Good and Evil. But in Buddhism, as Nietzsche says, beyond morality, compassion is treated as a means to an end. Getting free of one's karma, getting free of suffering. So too is evil treated as bad because of the consequences of evil, not because there's some sort of essential nature of evil that has to be opposed. There's another passage in the Gay Science I'm not going to read from at this time, but where Nietzsche says that the creative act of the founders of religions is an act of selection, meaning that the one who founds a religion and thus legislates values does not do so ex nihilo, but ex materia. He has to identify the commonly held traits and qualities of the population that he preaches to. He has to be able to discern which among those traits he can work with and then select for them. And the priest, the ascetic, the holy man is, as Nietzsche argues in Genealogy, a new kind of aristocracy, but an aristocracy that's uplifted by the belief, the reverence showed to them by the populace, rather than an aristocracy that establishes itself based on force. And so the priestly aristocracy always ends up having to select for, having to represent the values of the herd, because their creative act is that very selection from amongst the common values that provide the best possibilities for regulating and reshaping human beings. And as is a theme throughout the early chapters of the Gay Science, the value of pity or compassion is beneficial to the ordinary type of person who feels that his existence depends primarily on others, who doesn't have a well-developed sense of independence, who finds his highest feelings in the love of neighbors and trust in the ones closest to him, in a communal existence. And compassion serves as one of the most beneficial values for those types. The Buddhist recapitulates to all of this in Nietzsche's view, meaning that the creation of the last man, the movement of mankind toward a totally nihilistic, totally gregarious, instrumentalized, passive way of life will always be unopposed by the Buddhists, maybe even helped along by it. Nietzsche writes in the Genealogy, this is the 5th section of its preface, quote, "I realized that the morality of pity, which spread wider and wider, and whose grip infected even philosophers with its disease, was the most sinister symptom of our modern European civilization. I realized that it was the route along which that civilization slid on its way to a new Buddhism, a European Buddhism, nihilism. This exaggerated estimation in which modern philosophers have held pity is quite a new phenomenon. Up to that time, philosophers were absolutely unanimous as to the worthlessness of pity. I need only mention Plato, Spinoza, La Rochefoucauld, and Kant, 4 minds as mutually different as is possible, but united on one point, their contempt of pity." End quote. And so when I said at the beginning that Nietzsche is haunted by the notion of a European Buddhism, this is what I mean. In some sense, it's like, for all the praise that's been given to Buddhism, if we just look at Nietzsche's philosophy as this way or the other way, right? The overman or the last man. 2 movements, 2 directions in which you can proceed. Buddhism goes in the last man direction. And so in some sense, it's like, that is the dividing line. If we're looking for a yes, a no, a straight line, a goal, we have to place Buddhism on the nihilistic side of things. And, in Nietzsche's philosophy, it should be said, it's impossible that decline should be avoided. Ascent and decline are part of the rhythm of life. can't be denied. He writes in Will to Power 23, Nihilism, a normal condition. I mean, the Buddhists would agree, right? With birth comes death, two sides of the same coin. One, at first is young and lively, eventually you grow old and exhausted, so decline is unavoidable. The question regards the sort of superordinate ascent or decline, right? Of whether or not it's possible to suss out movement on the grand scale, not these sort of rises and falls of civilizations or individual cultures, but on the level of the whole species, divine where it's going. And on this level of analysis, Nietzsche sees the religions of pity as necessarily religions of decline. I've talked about Nietzsche's critique of pity in the concluding episodes of Season 2, if I remember correctly, so you can look into that as well. We also described the connection between Buddhism and decline in the previous episode. But what troubles Nietzsche about this possibility is that after the death of God is fully realized, after it fully dawns into awareness, there's this immense opportunity coupled with an immense danger that faces Europe. There's this development of the moral skepticism that digs into the value of all things, interrogates all claims, all moral claims, including the moral value of the truth. There's the emergence of scientific materialism that disregards all miracles, all superstitions, all metaphysical stories about existence. Christianity becomes unbelievable, and the nihilism inherent to Christianity brings about its own demise. In one passage in Zarathustra, too, Nietzsche even says that it is pity itself that killed God, that one day he choked to death on his all too great pity. Rather, it's a retired pope who says that, but he's a character in Zarathustra. So the collapse of these metaphysical assumptions will destroy the foundations of European morality. Nietzsche believes that Christianity has been life-denying, but this is the inflection point where, again, we could have a new life-affirming attitude that could come into being. And so he's contrasting Christianity, therefore, with Hellenism and Christ with Dionysus to show, again, these two directions, what the alternatives are. But this brings us back to that problem, right, of what if sickness is the ordinary thing and health is something extraordinary? And what if this is a rather daring proposal for a new valuation? Is it not more likely that having destroyed the traditional and revelatory basis for morality, Europe will not abandon the morality, but simply attach a secular basis to it? And indeed, Nietzsche thinks that the ascetic ideal persists in science, in positivism, in materialism. As we've mentioned throughout, Buddhism offers a rather pragmatic approach, one which has a kind of goodwill for empiricism, for knowledge through experience. And Buddhism has a kind of looseness about what you have to believe or have faith in. And I think these elements, which are perhaps some of the most admirable elements about Buddhism, are maybe the biggest problem with it. Because now we don't have to speculate, right? Nietzsche was speculating in his time. We've now seen the rise of secularism, and we've now seen that Buddhism is more popular than ever in the West. And it really appeals to post-Christian and post-religious Westerners because of the very fact that its morality is beyond morality, or beyond good and evil, and the way that Nietzsche presents it here, as a means to an end. And the metaphysics is largely taken as optional, especially in the Western context. And it has also proven very easy to integrate Buddhism into Western capitalist societies, where it can be used as a kind of safety valve or mental training for dealing with the stresses of that way of life. I mean, the example I always think of is that at Amazon warehouses, they rolled out this thing. I don't know if they stuck with this, but they said, we're going to have an Amazon booth. They literally called it that, where you can go in and do some mindfulness meditation on your 10-minute break or whatever, and be at peace, be indifferent to the fact that you're a wage slave in this warehouse, right? And these horrible working conditions. I don't know. I've never worked for Amazon, but from what I understand, most people don't like it. So, in any case, we can leave all of those kinds of criticisms aside. I think we should just notice the reality. It's Buddhism has latched on very well to our secular worldview, and given the ways that Nietzsche has kind of tried to vivisect the Buddhist religion, I think there's a sense to this. And if that's the road that Western society goes down, then we're keeping the value of pity. We're keeping this, what might we say, this herd morality. We're keeping this nihilism in play, essentially, in our valuations. We're just abandoning the fanaticism of Christianity, its doctrine of sin, the inner drama of guilt and pride that it creates. Perhaps the death of God moves us from an indirect nihilism to a kind of total nihilism, total passivity, whereas before we at least believed that the ascetic ideal was part of a process of salvation resulting in eternal life, even if it was in actuality a secret path to nothingness. Now with Western Buddhism, at least, we're just openly saying this is a path to nothingness, right? We're embracing total nihilism. And, as we've already said, nihilism might be the normal condition. It arises again and again in the course of human history. But if we embrace Buddhist passivity at this great moral interregnum, then the possibility of a new valuation based on the Dionysian, based on will to power, based on overflowing life, that will all be lost, that possibility. And Buddhism will do nothing to change the direction in which man proceeds, the direction of becoming the perfect cow, passive nihilist, the last man. Is there any way to avert such an outcome from Nietzsche's perspective? Nietzsche makes a suggestion in Will to Power, active nihilism, sort of acknowledging the situation as it is, that we are at a nihilistic place, but forging a nihilism of activity. Deleuze puts it this way in his book on Nietzsche. For the longest time, in the ascetic religions, the pity-based religions, the nihilistic religions, reactive forces have been wedded to the will to nothingness. They've gone hand in hand. The last man is the breaking of that alliance. The last man has no will to nothingness. He does not wish to will at all. He's purely reactive. His entire activity is simply managerial, right? The work of preserving both the self and the community. Managerialism is inherently reactive. You're just trying to maintain a status quo, reacting to the problems that disrupt that. And so the last man doesn't really seek anything outside of himself, outside of his current form of life. He doesn't want to sacrifice himself for a grand cause, right? That's the kind of fanaticism of Christianity that's fallen by the wayside. But on the other side of that coin, the will to nothingness is now broken off from the reactive forces. The will to nothingness can now be harnessed by active forces. In the name of clearing the ground so that something new and affirmative can be born, we can apply our energy, our active vigor, to the task of destroying the old. Clearly, the old valuations have not been thoroughly uprooted because the moral values underlying Christianity and its underlying nihilism, its devaluation of the world, still persist. And in a way, we can see now how Buddhism is slotting in as like a secularized nihilism that can take that over. And so if this nihilistic age is to be turned instead into something productive, we have to push our nihilism into a destructive form of activity and destroy the last vestiges of the Christian valuations so that no new nihilism will take hold. And as such, we're going to look at one final paragraph today, again from Will to Power. This is number 23, in which Nietzsche makes another comparison on this basis of active nihilism versus the passive nihilism of the Buddhists. Quote, "It may be a sign of strength. Spiritual vigor may have increased to such an extent that the goals toward which man has marched hitherto, the, quote, convictions, articles of faith, are no longer suited to it. For a faith generally expresses the exigencies of the conditions of existence, a submission to the authority of an order of things, which conduces to the prosperity, the growth, and power of a living creature. On the other hand, a sign of insufficient strength, to fix a goal, a wherefore, and a faith for itself. It reaches its maximum of relative strength as a powerful destructive force in the form of active nihilism. Its opposite would be weary nihilism, which no longer attacks, its most renowned form being Buddhism, as passive nihilism a sign of weakness. Spiritual strength may be fatigued, exhausted, so that the goals and values which have prevailed hitherto are no longer suited to it and are no longer believed in, so that the synthesis of values and goals upon which every strong culture stands decomposes, and the different values contend with one another. Disintegration, then everything which is relieving, which heals, becalms, or stupefies, steps into the foreground, under the cover of various disguises, either religious, moral, political, or aesthetic, etc." End quote. Even here, we get this intimation of the immense practical value of Buddhism. When everything is falling apart, this kind of doctrine acts as a balm, as a salve. It may even be the appropriate kind of religiosity for a people who is on the decline. But it does not provide an affirmation of life. It will ultimately participate in bringing forth a totally nihilistic form of human life. Now, at the end of this long analysis, how are we to settle the dispute between Nietzschean values and Buddhist values? As Nietzsche says, we can't claim to be objective, dispassionate arbiters in this respect. Our decision will reflect the overall judgments that we have made about reality, which will always be unfair, they'll always be unjust, a kind of falsification of the world. And it should also be said that Nietzsche, for his part, is certainly not being fair to the Buddhists, nor should his views on Buddhism be taken as definitive or objective or anything like that. As with all of the philosophers we've brought up in these episodes, Epicurus, Anaximander, Heraclitus, Pyrrho, Schopenhauer, his views on the Buddha and the way he presents the Buddhist religion, that's something that Nietzsche does for his own purposes. He's using Buddhism in order to show us something, to draw out insights through contrast. And he gets quite a bit of mileage out of Buddhism in that regard. But if you're left wondering whether his assessment of Buddhism leaves something to be desired, no pun intended, I mean, yeah, that's almost certainly true. And I don't believe anyone should make their own determinations about the truth of Buddhism or from studying Nietzsche, without at least first studying the religion. For all the harsh words we have spoken today, I think it is only appropriate to end this 2-episode series in the beginning of Season 7 with a final point on which the Buddha and Zarathustra were in agreement. Zarathustra famously told his followers to abandon him. He told them to leave him, to fully rebuke him, and only then could they find him again. His teaching was deceptively simple. You must find your own way and not simply follow my way. I'm not going to say Buddhism doesn't cultivate respect for one's teachers, for a religious hierarchy of veneration, but its emphasis, to say it once more, has always been on attaining knowledge for oneself, knowing for oneself the way that leads to the relief of suffering and the end of rebirth. And this is the most agreeable aspect of Buddhism to me, and one of the beloved teachers of Buddhism from recent times, the Venerable Ajahn Chah, who came from the Thai forest tradition, gave expression to this in one of his Dharma talks. And so, with the injunction of Zarathustra to abandon him in mind, we will conclude with Ajahn Chah, quote, "If I were to give you all a fruit and tell you it's delicious, you should take note of my words, but don't believe me offhand, because you haven't tasted it yet. The teaching I give you today is the same. If you want to know whether the fruit is sweet or sour, you have to slice a piece off and taste it. Then you will know its sweetness or sourness. Then you could believe me, because you'd have seen for yourself. So please don't throw this fruit away. Keep it and taste it. Know its taste for yourself." The Buddha didn't have a teacher, An ascetic once asked him who his teacher was, and the Buddha answered that he didn't have one. The ascetic just walked off, shaking his head. The Buddha was being too honest. He was speaking to one who couldn't know or accept the truth. That's why I tell you not to believe me. The Buddha said that to simply believe others is foolish, because there is no clear knowing within. That's why the Buddha said, "I have no teacher." End quote. As always, the purpose of this podcast is not to get you to adopt me as your teacher, nor even Nietzsche, nor even the audacious Zarathustra. All of us should be abandoned, and even Buddha didn't have a teacher. Even Buddha said, you have to taste this, you have to experience it for yourself. So that's my word out there, perhaps a conciliatory word to all the Buddhists, that this is not a final or absolute judgment on Buddhism. It's just an articulation of Nietzsche's perspective in regard to his own project, so that people will understand that perspective. And so I hope no one will take any of this as gospel and will be faithful and true to Zarathustra's teaching, which means rejecting him as a teacher. That's all for this talk, everyone. Welcome to Season 7 of the Nietzsche Podcast. Cheers. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche Podcast or found it helpful, You can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.